So let's dive straight into it with the first part on research data management, fair data, and DMP. Let's start with the definition. What is research data management, or RDM? In that CESSDA training portfolio, the RDM is defined as anything that refers to how you handle your data, how you organize your data, how you structure your research data in every step along the research process. So usually research data management starts during the planning process, when you set up your project, when you decide in which repository you will deposit your data, when you decide how you store the data during the research process, etc. During data collection, research data management can guide you through questions like how to name your files, which file naming conventions to employ, or which folder structure is best suited to your research project. During the preparation and analysis part, research data management can help you with guidelines how to document your data and how to make your research reproducible. When it comes to archiving, the main question is usually where to publish your data and in what way to curate your data and prepare your data for archiving. Then the next step usually is publishing your data, and finally reusing data, or making, if you work yourself on a project, preparing your data in the best possible way so that it can be reused by others. So basically the goal is to make your data reusable, or if you reuse data from others, good research data management will reveal itself if you can reuse it easily, understand the data easily, and can work with them easily. Why is research data management important? Many funding bodies require research data management in their funding guidelines. For instance, the European Commission conventionally asks researchers to publish their data as open as possible. Also, many academic journals now require researchers to publish the research data on which the analysis of their papers is based. So research data management allows you to both meet the requirements of funding bodies and of many academic journals. Second, also many research performing institutions, many universities have policies in place regarding research data management. And if you follow the guidelines, you can comply with these policies. For instance, many universities require researchers to archive the research data for at least 10 years. Research data can make your research more efficient. If you plan your research process at the beginning of your research project, and you lay out all the steps that you need to deal and that you need to tackle along the way, it allows you to get ahead of problems. Example could be that when you work with personal data and when you conduct a survey, it's good practice to let respondents sign a consent form. And in this consent form, you should already describe clearly which steps you will take and how you will process the personal data, where they will be published, who will have access, under which conditions you will make the data accessible. So if you think about all these steps before you start working with your actual research data, it makes your life a lot easier and your research more efficient, because you can get ahead of problems. Also, research data allows you to advance research in your discipline and beyond, because it allows others to reuse your data, and also it allows you to reuse data of others. So you can build upon existing data and advance research instead of reinventing the wheel and starting a new from scratch. And of course, it's also good for yourself because it makes your research more efficient, and so you save time, you can work more efficiently, and you can focus on other parts of your research and your career. This is a slogan that you will encounter many times during research data management trainings. And the slogan is as open as possible, as closed as necessary. So this is the mantra of how you should share your data. Sharing it as open as possible, but on the other hand, there are some well-established reasons why research data should be not completely opened, but as closed as necessary. So the goal is not to open research data completely free, but to make research data fair, which means make it findable, make it accessible, make it interoperable, and make it reusable. Especially in the social sciences, we often work with personal data, and personal data is one of the reasons why research data usually cannot be openly accessible, because we have to protect our respondents' privacy and our research subjects' privacy and comply to data protection regulations. So especially in social sciences, following the guidelines of making data fair is usually the way to go. And as soon as you work with personal data, making data openly and accessible to everyone without restrictions often is not possible. We will talk about this in detail later, but now let's go through the individual steps of fair data. So the first letter in FAIR stands for Findable. This means that data and metadata should be easy to find by both people and machines. Machine-readable and descriptive metadata enables the discovery of interesting datasets. What does this contain? So for instance, data should always have a persistent identifier like a DOI or a handle. So if you choose a repository to publish your data, it's crucial that you choose a repository that assigns, for instance, DOIs. Then research data also should be enriched with metadata, which means that research data should be described, for instance, with keywords and with an extensive abstract, and depending on the repository infrastructure you use, there are many more fields, for instance, fields that allow you to enter the countries in which you collected the data or the time frame in which you collected the data. So it's crucial to make metadata as rich as possible so that others can find your data. It's also good to use standardized vocabularies. There are standardized vocabularies, for instance, for fields of sciences or standardized keywords. And these vocabularies allow others to easier find your data, because they also allow for easy aggregation of metadata, which brings us to the last point. You should register data in a searchable catalog, and ideally in a catalog that allows for harvesting metadata to other catalogs. For instance, the data catalog at the Austrian Social Science Data Archive is harvested by CESSDA. So the CESSDA data catalog contains metadata of many CESSDA repositories, which means that you don't have to go to each individual CESSDA archive to search for data, but instead you can use the European metadata catalog and search for data there, and you can then find data that is stored in different archives in different countries. And if you choose a repository that allows for this possibility, you allow for an easier findability of your data. The OpenAIR data catalog would be another of these metadata catalogs that contain metadata of many archives. The A in FAIR stands for accessible. So data, research data should be accessible, and they should be archived and made available in such a way that allows for easy retrieval and download by machines and people. So for instance, this comprises transparent access options. As I said before, fair data does not mean that research data are completely open, accessible for everyone for every reason, but it must be clearly outlined under which conditions research data are accessible. For instance, if you work with highly sensitive data, it could be a solution to restrict the access options to only grant access after someone submits a research proposal and outlines why he or she requires your data in your research project. This could be a legit way of restricting access as long as the process is transparent for everyone. AAI stands for Authorization and Authentication Infrastructure if necessary. So if the access to data is restricted, there should be such an authorization and authentication infrastructure in place, for instance, by using Shibboleth and allow researchers to log in via their institutional accounts. Nevertheless, data should be as open as possible, which means that researchers should make precautions and take measurements to minimize the need for access restrictions. We will talk more about this later on. And metadata should be accessible even if the data are not accessible anymore. So it's good practice that even if data are not accessible anymore for whatever reason, that the metadata nevertheless stay online, and that the DOI that are also assigned to your data will lead you at least to your metadata. The I in FAIR stands for interoperable. This means that data should be available in such a way that people and machines can exchange, interpret, and combine these with other datasets in a semi-automated way. So, for instance, you should point out how your data is interoperable with other data. Data should allow for interoperability, for instance, with APIs from the side of machines. Proper documentation enhances interoperability, and different and common formats enhances interoperability. So for instance, of course, you're free to work with whatever format is your preferred format during your research project, but then when you publish your data, it's often easy to publish it in multiple formats. And for instance, if you work with a Stata format, you could also export your data in a CSV format to allow others to reuse your data. Also, it's good practice to, whenever possible, use standardized codes or standardized vocabularies. For instance, if you work with different countries, it's better to use standardized codes for these countries instead of your own. Or if you work with education degrees or with professions, or with fields of sciences, it's better to use established categories and established ways of classify these variables than inventing your own. So ISCO categories, ISCAT categories, for instance, come to mind if you handle data. And the R stands for usability. So a good description of data and metadata ensures that it can be reused for future research. Data should be permanently citable, such as with DOI. And this also means that data should be licensed. So with a license, it's clearly regulated how others can reuse your data. Without a license, others are not able to reuse your data unless they explicitly ask for your permission. So it's good to assign appropriate licenses depending on the content of your research data. And also additional documentation material allows for reusability and enhances the reusability of your data so that others can understand your data. And And this documentation material also comprises all measures of quality control that you may undertake, because usually quality is one of the main factors when researchers decide whether or not they are going to reuse someone else's data. So highlighting all the qualities, all the quality control steps that you likely will implement in your research project as a standard way how you handle your data is always helpful. So in this case, it's more a matter of writing down what you do in your everyday work so that others can also see how you made sure that your data is of good quality. So where to put down all this information? The best place for this information is the data management plan, or DMPs. So DMPs should contain all relevant aspects of research data management. So all the steps I have mentioned so far and many more, they really can cover all necessary information entire the research data lifecycle. Data management plans are a formal document, so usually there is really a formal document, a Word document with the data, with the title Data Management Plans. Data management plans are a living document, which means that, of course, a plan is a plan and may change over time. And it's legit and necessary to adjust the plan accordingly during your research project. So you usually start with Data Management Plan version 1, and the goal is to update it regularly every time when there are substantial changes to your research data management plan or to your project. So the idea is to keep the data management plan always updated, and it's very legit to have multiple versions of a data management plan along your research project. Data management plans are mandatory for many grants and are often one of the first deliverables for grants. So for many grants, the funders require researchers to hand in a data management plan either before the project starts or at the latest 6 months after the project begins. Also, the funders sometimes asked for updates in the data management plans, either in the middle of the project or at the end of the project, when then the data is actually published and information can be added where the data is published, and the DOIs can be added to the data management plan. Some funders sometimes also require researchers to update data management plans and resubmit this deliverable when there are any major changes, for instance, when a new consortium members enters a consortium. Data management plans can vary in their content depending on your research data and the requirements per funders. Funders usually are most interested in how you make your research data fair, but it's also very useful to go into detail in all aspects that cover research data management during your research project, like which file naming conventions you follow, which folder structure you follow, how you regulate the access to your research data during your research project. Research data management plan also allows you for planning for the future. So data management plans can really guide you through your project and allow you to follow the individual steps that you have set up during your projects and also beyond. For instance, if you work with personal data, it's also important to delete data that is not necessary anymore. And the data management plan is one document where you can assign responsibility. Who is responsible for deleting data, especially after the end of a project, when the individual researchers and members may have moved on to different projects and the former project is not on the top priority list anymore. How does DMP usually look like. There are different templates for it, but frequently found sections are the administrative information that is usually at the beginning. What's the title of the project? Who is the PI? Who is responsible for research data management? How many resources are allocated for research data management, for instance? Then usually a description of your data follows. So how does the data look like that you handle in your research project? Do you collect data or do you reuse data? If you reuse data, what are possible restraints, for instance, which licenses are assigned to your data? These are aspects that you can and should discuss in this section. Then there is often a section on research data management during your research project. For instance, where do you store your data? Who provides for the storage locations? Usually funders prefer managed storage locations with automatic backups, like storage provided by research performing organizations that have automatic backups in place. And also access regulations to your data is a very good thing to regulate in advance. So who has access to your data? What happens if a PhD student who works on your project changes affiliations or changes supervisors? What is he or she allowed to use to work with the data or not? So these things are good to lay out in the DMP. And then the larger sections usually is how to make your data fair. So for instance, in which repository do you publish your data? When will you publish your data? At the end of the research project, as soon as this is ready, or along with your data publications. So these are all questions that can and should be answered in this section. How do you minimize the need for access restrictions is also an important aspect. Which license do you choose? Do you choose CC BY license? Do you choose or do you publish your data under public domain? Or else do you work with personal data that may require a license that is dedicated specifically to the needs of these data? What metadata and documentation material accompany your data is also an important aspect. And finally, a last section usually are legal and ethic considerations of your data, for instance, whether or not you work with personal data or whether there are any ethical challenges involved in your research project. There are different DMP templates and checklists available, for instance, for Horizon Europe or for Science Europe, and there's also the CESSDA checklist. So before you write your PNG, please check your funders' requirements. They may require you to follow a certain template for your DMP. There are different tools available that aim at supporting you in writing your DMP. For instance, Argos, which is provided by OpenAIRE, the Data Stewardship Wizard, or DMP Online. If you would like to have a look at existing DMPs, there are collections available at the Digital Curation Center and at FEDRA, the University of Vienna. But please note that these DMPs are not evaluated, so you can find both DMPs that are very well written and DMPs that could benefit from improvement. And there is also a data horror escape room if you feel for challenging yourself in a virtual escape room. These are now many points we've covered so far and many buzzwords flying around. Where do you find support on research data management and where do you find support on writing your DMP? So first, the recommendation is to check if there are data stewards embedded at your institution, maybe at your faculty, maybe at your department. Data stewards usually work very closely together with researchers, so they both know their way around research data management, and they also are aware of the challenges in their fields. If there are no data stewards, there may be an institutional RDM team that works for and supports the researchers for the entire university or their entire institutions regarding all RDM matters. Some repositories also offer support concerning research data management, and there's CESSDA training archive for training materials available online, and of course there are many material online available that help you with all questions on research data management. So we have now reached the first part of, or the end of the first part of the webinar. Do you have any questions on research data management basics, FAIR data, or DMPs? Okay. If there aren't any, let's continue with personal data and how to work with personal data. Let's start again with a definition. What is personal data? According to the GDPR, personal data is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, which is referred to as data subject. Please be aware here or that the subject does not only the GDPR does not only imply if the subject is clearly identified, but also if there is a potential that this natural person is identifiable. Natural person also means that's indeed a living person and not, for instance, a company. GDPR only applies to living natural persons, which means that if you work with data on deceased persons, for instance, on political actors who were active in the 18th century, GDPR does not apply anymore. However, there may be other reasons why to protect this data or why to handle personal data carefully. Anonymous or anonymized data is not considered personal data anymore, which means that if you anonymize your data in a way that does not allow it anymore for anyone to identify a natural person, then this data is counted as or is regarded as anonymous, and the GDPR does not apply anymore. What is not still, if data or personal data is not covered by the GDPR, there may be other reasons to protect data anyway. For instance, there may be ethical reasons or contractual reasons or other reasons that require you to protect data, or that other reasons that make it necessary to handle this data especially careful. Sensitive data is a special category of personal data, which requires you to treat this data even with more care. And sensitive data is any information that poses a risk to fundamental rights and freedoms, and that comprise ethnic origins, political opinions, religious or ideological beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data, or data concerning the sex life or sexual orientation of a natural person. This means that if you work with, for instance, survey data on how respondents or how the population of a country intends to vote or voting decisions, this already may fall into this category of sensitive data because it covers political opinions. The GDPR distinguishes between identifiers, between direct identifiers and indirect identifiers. So direct identifiers usually straightforward. Direct identifiers is any information that allows for the identification of a person without any ambiguity. For instance, the name of a person, the email address of a person, or a unique identification number like matriculation number, social security ID, or an IP address. Indirect identifiers are more tricky because they are less clear or may contain more ambiguity. So indirect identifiers are any information that concerns the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of a natural person. So basically all sorts of demographic information, for instance, gender, age, profession, place of residence, etc. So if you work with personal data, should you process or how should you handle personal data? So the best solution is to not collect identifying information if you don't need it. So researchers by nature are usually very curious, but the best way of dealing with personal data is to assess very strictly, do I need this piece of information? For instance, do I need to collect the precise birthday of a respondent, or maybe is it sufficient for me to have a checkbox where you're eligible to vote in the last election if I'm, for instance, interested if a person also was old enough to participate in an election. So best solution is to not collect identifying information and minimize the amount of personal data you collect. The second best solution is editing information to exclude identification, and this process is called information. So for direct identifiers, this process is usually straightforward and requires removing these direct identifiers like names, phone numbers, or social security numbers. When it comes to indirect identifiers, the process is usually more tricky and can involve the removing of information, the replacing of information, or the aggregating of information. For instance, the combination of occupation, income, age, gender, or place of residence. So for instance, you could recode the age of your respondents to age categories. So instead of the precise age, you could have age categories like age 21 to 30, 31 to 40, and so forth. You could aggregate, for instance, questions on the religious denomination and check which categories you have covered in there. For instance, in your Austrian national election studies, there often was one respondent who disclosed that he or she was a part of a Buddhist or Judaism. So these religious denominations had a very low number of observations in the data set. So the way to go here is often to recode this information and aggregate it, for instance, to the category other religious denominations. The goal is in the end to make your data or to aggregate the data in a way that minimizes the risk of re-identification for respondents. And finally, the rule is, or the recommendation is, if personal data is not needed anymore or is not needed, delete it. And if you keep personal data, you have to have a reason for it. So now we have heard a lot about personal data and that you have to protect personal data. And we have also heard about research funding agencies and researchers' journals and research ethics that requires you to make your data openly accessible. How does these two demands go together? So on the one hand, you are required by law to protect the privacy of these research data subjects. On the other hand, you're required by your funding bodies and your research performing organizations to make your data available. How can you meet both of these demands? So The solution here is to make your data fair, as I've already laid out in the first part of the webinar. So handle your data sensibly along the entire cycle of the research data, research data cycle, so from planning to reusing. You don't have to make your data openly accessible to everyone, but here comes the slogan in: make it open as possible, but as close as necessary. And data does not have to be completely open to be fair and to meet your funding body's requirement. Usually, if you work with personal data, you need a legal basis for processing this personal data, as Article 6 in the GDPR lays out. So you need to plan ahead and take the necessary measurements. In most cases, this means you have to get consent from your research subjects. So it's good practice and also required by law to develop consent forms and adapt it to your project. Please be careful. There are many consent forms template out there that are very good, but also there are others who are missing certain aspects, especially the information about archiving and reusing of the data. So it's crucial that you already outline in your consent form where you will archive your data and under which conditions your data is made reusable. There are still some templates around that have formulations in there like research data will not be shared with third parties and only within the research project. If your consent form contains formulations like this, it is very, very hard or impossible to archive your data and to live up to your funders' expectations. So some guidelines on data protections: be sure to have the necessary rights to store personal and sensitive data along all the steps of the research data lifecycle, including a long-term data storage. For instance, get consent from your research subjects that you are allowed to handle their data in this way. Be sure that you choose a safe environment to store your research data. For instance, lay out clear roles who has access to your research data during the lifetime of your research project, who has access to the non-anonymized data. Is it necessary that, for instance, all your student assistants have access to this data? If someone leaves the team, be sure to remove his or her access privileges. And what other protection measures are in place? For instance, is there a firewall in place? Do you work with encryption software to protect your personal data? Data protection also comes into place when you publish personal data or when you publish sensitive data. So the goal here is to choose a repository or an infrastructure that offers the appropriate safety measures. For instance, the repositories that allow for the implementation of access mechanisms and access control, for instance, that allow you to restrict access to your data, and repositories that allow you to limit or restrict the reuse options of your data through licenses. For instance, the Austrian Social Science Data Archive, person or data from social science projects conventionally are published with a license that only allows for scientific reuse and not a CC BY license that would allow for a much more open way of reusing data. And of course, it's also important to present information in a way that also complies to data protection regulations. So, for instance, by anonymizing your data before you are archiving it and before you store it long term is usually the way to go how you handle your personal data. I've now reached the end of this part on personal data. Are there any questions regarding personal data or how you can handle them? Please note the questions part will not be recorded, or will be recorded but we will remove later on. So please feel free to reach out to us. Okay, and if there are no questions, let's move on to the third part about data curation and how to select a repository. Let's start with formats of quantitative and qualitative data. So as you may have already encountered when you're reusing data of others, there are different formats around. Usually, a main way to distinguish between formats are proprietary formats like Stata, SAS, or MaxQDR, and there are open formats or non-proprietary formats like CSV or R and Python. So funders usually encourage researchers to work with open formats and to use open source software because it does not restrict the potential reuse options and it's easier to reuse this kind of data. Of course, you are nevertheless free to work with the formats that you prefer during your research project lifetime. So if you work with data, please go on and continue work with data. But once you publish your data, easy solution is to export the data also in different formats, for instance, as CSV, to allow our Python users to reuse their data easily. Now let's talk about documentation. So why is documentation important? Documentation is a major point of making your data fair and often falls under this reusability aspect. Why is documentation important? So a good documentation allows others to reuse your data easily and more comfortable. Good documentation also facilitates your life because it makes the resubmissions of your work easier, both to journals and both to supervisors. Every one of you who has opened or has spent a lot of time on a research project will know that it's often very hard to find your way around during old scripts. So clearly laying out why you made this or that change to the data and why you implemented this or that step really facilitates your work and your life later on and makes it easier to retrace your step and also prove and clearly outline why you made these measurements or why you made these changes to your data. Documentation is important for large quantitative data sets, for instance, all the variable names, the variable labels, and all the value labels of the individual values of categorical data. So if you have a large quantitative data set with 500 variables, which are labeled variable 1 through variable 500, you really need documentation and a good documentation to find your way around this data set. Documentation is equally important for qualitative data set. It just looks differently. So in qualitative data sets, it's will go more in a direction that you write down the coding procedure and describe your categories, for instance, and all the process, how you transcribed, for instance, your data and which measures you took to anonymize your data. For both quantitative and qualitative data sets, the essence remains the same. Good documentation requires you to write down a lot of information. How does good practice for documentation in quantitative data sets look like. The one tool that allows for easy documentation is using scripts. So scripts allow for documenting all individual steps of data wrangling. So it's preferable to use scripts for working with your data. Scripts allow your data to make it reusable, and it also is a first step towards documentation. And it's much more preferable to use scripts instead of, for instance, clicking your way around statistical software. For quantitative data sets, versioning is also essential. So we recommend that you start out with a raw data set that you never ever change and keep in a separate folder. Then when you start working with this raw data, you may create new variables with existing variables. You may merge data, you may collapse data, you may make changes to the data and aggregate data, for instance, to age categories. So for these steps, we recommend to use a version, for instance, 0_1 and 0_2. Once you are happy with a version of this data set and would now like to really start analyzing this data, we recommend that you label or you name this data then version 1_0, and this then would be the first version where you base your analysis on. If you, for instance, go back and start again with working on your data and preparing it for analysis, for instance, in a resubmission to a scientific paper, you could then label this data set version 1_1, and once you start analyzing, this data should have then the name version 2_0. Some guidelines on how to naming variables. So best practice is to start with a letter and not with a number. Usually it's easier to work with speaking names. So it's easier to work with a variable that's called age instead of a variable that's called variable 1. But of course, are especially large data sets out there who follow the pattern of variable 1 through n. In this case, it's essential to have a very good code book at hand. And then it's easier to handle long variable names if the individual words are separated from one another. In this example, it's camel cases. Another way to handle these variable names or distinguish these individual words of a long variable name could be separating the words with underscores, like in the first example here. Code books help here a lot and are essential. So, for instance, if you work with survey data, it can, of course, only work with short, or it's easier to work with short variable names, but in the code book, then the precise question wording of the question is clearly documented and laid out. For quantitative data, it's also recommended to have value labels for categorical data. So the recommendation is to label all values of categorical data. So all data that is represented as numbers which refer to different categories, like 1 for natural sciences, 2 for social sciences, and so on and so forth. So if you work with categories of scientific disciplines, for instance. If you work with scales, it's recommended to label at least extreme points of a scale. So does 1 stand for very important and 5 for not important at all, or the other way around? It's recommended to reuse the values and the labels consistently throughout your dataset. So if you start labeling your data and use 0 for no and 1 for yes, the recommendation is to use this consistently throughout your dataset. It's also recommended to represent missing values consistently throughout your dataset. So for instance, to have one category for don't know, which could be 99 for each and every question throughout your dataset. Some statistical software also allows for system missings, missings that are part of the software. For instance, in Stata, it's a dot. Please be aware that if you export this kind of data to other statistical programs, this may cause troubles. So although it's very convenient to work with system missings, it's more reusable to label missings or different kinds of missings with actual numbers, as we use numbers instead of system missings and label them accordingly. Also here, codebooks are essential so that you and others keep track of what the individual values of your data stand for. For qualitative projects, it's essential to identify identifiers. So it's essential to go through your data many times to get a feeling of what identifiers are in your project and also how you deal with this identifiers and find guidelines how you handle them. And also in this case, documentation is essential. How could this look like in detail? So the recommendation is to work with anonymization plans. So once you start collecting your data, have an anonymization plan in place that can be, of course, adapted, but that should already cover a majority of the cases. So in this anonymization plan, it's essential to lay out when the data will be anonymized, how the data will be anonymized, and who is responsible for the anonymization process. The next step would be reading the interviews very carefully and then find direct and indirect identifiers. Direct identifiers could be a name, indirect identifiers could be the name of a company. And then it's essential to set up guidelines how to replace these identifiers. One possible way is to replace them with placeholders, so to replace Max Mustermann with name and replace McDonald's with big company. There are other approaches which would entail replacing, for instance, names with other names that are comparable to these names, but they should, of course, not lead to the identification of someone. So not nicknames, and they should not be related to these names. So for instance, instead of Max, you could use Franz or any other German name in this case. It's essential to write down these guidelines on the one hand to make it reproducible also for yourself, but also on the other hand, if you work in larger research projects, these anonymization plans are essential to guarantee that all project members handle their data in a similar way and make this anonymization process in a similar way. If you would like to have an example, you'll find a link here on the slide for a good example of an anonymization plan. So now we have covered the data curation process. So you'll have heard something about some guidelines and some tips how you can curate the data and which regulations and which guidelines you can or should follow. Now your data is ready for publication, and the question that arises here is how to select a repository and how to select a trustworthy repository. The general recommendation is that your data is most findable in a discipline-specific repository. So whenever you have the opportunity to deposit your data in a discipline-specific repository, this is regarded as the first choice. If there is no discipline-specific repository available, the second choice usually is an institutional repository, so a repository that is provided by your organization. And the third choice would be a generic repository or catch-all repository that accepts data from all disciplines and institutions like Zenodo or the Harvard Dataverse, Triad, or Figshare. How to find such repositories? So Reusable is a platform where repositories can enlist, and many repositories are on there. It's a very good platform for searching repositories, but please be aware that it's a self-selection system. So as soon as a repository has published one dataset, for instance, they can enlist here at this platform. So although there are many options there are many good repositories there, but there are also repositories on Reusable that may not fulfill all the requirements of a trustworthy repository. If you work with social science data, you could also have a look at the CESSDA archives and the list of CESSDA archives, so of all the archives that are part of the consortium for social science data archives. OpenAIRE is another the OpenAIRE data providers is another way of finding data providers to the OpenAIRE catalogs, and here many repositories are also enlisted. And for some funders, for instance, for the European Union, it's a necessary requirement that the repository you choose provides the metadata to OpenAIRE. Which brings me to the last point, check your funder's requirements. Depending on your funder, the organization may have specific regulations in place, which requirements a repository should fulfill, so that it's classified as trustworthy by your funder and that it's accepted by your funder. So if you now go to, for instance, to Reusable and you have this list of thousands of repositories, how to figure out which repository is trustworthy? A first way to look out is our certificates. For instance, the Core Trust Seal. Only a minority of the repositories is certified, and only a minority of the repositories possess the Core Trust Seal. But if you're lucky enough to find a discipline-specific repository that is certified, you have hit the jackpot and you can proceed with reaching out to this repository. A minimum criteria usually is that a repository assigns a persistent identifiers like a DOI. You can also find this at Reusable. There is a special icon whether or not a repository assigns a persistent identifier, and you also can filter for this information. Another thing to check are the terms of use and the license information available online. If this information is not available online, it's usually better to look if you have another option for archiving your data. If you work with personal data, it's essential to check whether the repository you consider offers the necessary infrastructure to protect your research subjects' privacy. So check which access mechanisms does the repository offer in case you require your data to be restricted instead of open access. And also check which licenses does the repository offer. If you work with personal data, sensitive data, an open license likely is not appropriate. and you likely have to restrict the reuse options of your data. Especially in the social sciences, there is a very good infrastructure already available, and some repositories offer licenses specifically for the needs of social science data that also contain personal data. And finally, please check whether there are metadata standards employed. The minimum metadata standards usually is Dublin Core, but the more metadata standards a repository offers, especially discipline-specific metadata standards, the more trustworthy or mature a repository usually is considered.